The next step that we are going to look at is the persistence. So managing persistent data, identifying and storing persistent data. So what does that mean when we say persistent data? Is data that is accessible after the system shut down. So if you think of writing something in a Word document, now when you save that word, when you save what you wrote, it will be stored on the hard disk. So when you close the system, when you close the Word application, it will disappear from the memory, but it will not disappear from the hard disk. Now, when you need it later, you can just open it, so which means that you just reload it to the memory and work on it. Okay, so this is one way to handle persistence, is just to save directly to the hard disk. Another more sophisticated way to handle persistence is to use a database management system. Now, the decisions you make about the persistence of your data affects how you're going to design the system. Okay, so that's a very important step during the design, because it affects how are you going to decompose the system, and it affects the responsibilities of the different components in your design. For example, if you're using the repository style, it means like the repository style means that there is one subsystem or one component that is dedicated to the storage of the data. Okay. Also, if you're gonna use a database management system, the type of the database that you're gonna use affects how you're going to design the code, because like they have different strategies for concurrencies and different ways to handle the data. So these decisions need to be made early on while you are in the design process, so that you can refine your design based on that. So you need to identify which objects need to be persistent. Not every object in your system, like not every object that is running on the system and needed while the system is running would be needed to be accessed later after you shut down. So we need to identify which of the objects will be needed to be persistent. Okay, will be needed after the system would shut down. These are the ones that you need to store. So in addition to the obvious type of objects, like the objects related to the business, mm, these are the ones that need to be persistent. Also, some metadata objects can also be needed for later, like preferences and configuration and stuff like that can also be needed to be persistent. Now, there are different ways to store the data. The simplest and easiest way is the flat files. If you just, the simple file is a plain file. So a plain text file is the simplest, fastest, lightest, easier way to handle data. The only problem with it is that it doesn't scale. So if your data is gonna be it's gonna be scaled, so you have large amount of data, and this data can change often, then a flat file would not be sufficient. You need a more sophisticated database management system. And in that, you have different types of database management. So you can have relational database or NoSQL database or document database. Okay, so these kind of decisions are needed because they will affect how you're going to create or develop your system. Now let's go to the my trip example and see how are we going to handle the persistence of the data there. So when we look at the requirements model, you will see that persistence was directly mentioned here, that in the planning subsystem needs to store the maps and other things in a database. It also mentions that uh, uh, the planned trip should be saved by name in a database. Here, the other component, the execute trip component, also mentions that it retrieves data from the server, and it might need to store them locally as well. Okay, so one way to handle that is to introduce two components. One component to handle the persistence of the data on the server, and another component to handle the persistence of the data on the client. So typically on the server, the persistence would be handled through database system, and oftentimes the persistence on the client would be handled in a flat file.